Skipster is the guest management platform used by top event teams for everything from guest lists to seating charts and online invitations. If you're looking for next-generation event software that helps deliver perfect guest experiences, head over to Skipster's website. It's Skipster, ZKIPSTER.com to try a free event.
Are you a follower? Okay, so we're gonna be
Welcome to GatherGeeks, a podcast by BizBash, the place where people passionate about meetings and events come together. Here are your hosts, BizBash CEO David Adler and Editor-in-Chief Beth Kormanik.
Welcome to GatherGeeks. I'm Beth Kormanik. David Adler is away today. Our guest is Lauren Kotkin, Director of Educational Programs for Exponent Philanthropy, a Washington, D.C.-based association for small foundations. The association has been gathering its members for conferences for more than 20 years, and they have developed a high-touch method for curating speakers, coaching them on developing their content, shaping the format and delivery, and then evaluating the sessions. If you plan conferences or work with speakers, this will give you a lot to think about. Let's take a listen.
We're here with Lauren. Let's first get a little bit about you, because we're going to talk about conference design. Yeah. Everyone will understand it better in the context of what you do.
Exponent Philanthropy is a membership association of what we like to call lean funders. These are folks who run philanthropies, some individual donors, but they run it with few or no staff. So a lot of people immediately think of family foundations. About half of our members are family foundations, the other half are not. They range in assets from under $1 million to hundreds of $1 millions. And what makes them all the same, what they have in common, is that they operate in a lean fashion. And some characteristics of lean funders, if you think about an organization, you have 300 people, so everyone is very specialized. In a lean organization, you just have a couple of people and everyone wears multiple hats and really knows what's going on. And so lean funders are close to the ground, they're nimble, they're agile, they know their communities, they step in when they see a need, they might scan the landscape to understand what's happening in the community. So this is our membership base.
What are they funding? They're funding community actions in local markets?
They are funding, in fact, because they fund so many different things, the range is incredible. We could get a group of funders, 5 of them together. They all fund education, but they could fund completely different things in education. So people might fund a range of topics. So you might have environmental funders, education funders, arts funders, human services funders, and then within that, you might have, let's say in education, you might have early childhood ed, after-school programs, tech programs, that range. But you also have a range in strategies. Someone might fund policies. Someone might fund scholarships. Someone might fund research to impact policy. So what they fund is an answer that's too long.
Okay, that makes sense. And now, how do you meet and keep people sustain the organization? Like, what do they get out of being a member?
What they get out of being a member, for one, is a network. So that we like to say guide, connect, and champion. We guide them through our resources, through conferences, through tools, online tools, and then connecting. They connect at meetings. They connect with each other through a discussion list. And then we like to champion the work of small funders, because there's a lot happening in the small funder world, that a lot of great stories that need to be told.
Okay, so tell us the story of your conference and the legacy of that conference.
So our organization started, the legend has it that they were at another association conference and it was time for roundtable conversations. And someone sat down at the table with a sign that said, "Are you alone with millions?" And people came to that roundtable and they decided to form an organization for these lean funders. And this is about 22 years ago, and this conference has been happening every other year for 20 years. So we meet biennially. We have 800 or 900 people. It's 2.5 days of content. We do pre-conference activities.
Let me ask you, what is, I believe that people who are conference organizers or collaboration artists, what do you do to allow these folks to collaborate?
Collaborate at the event or collaborate in planning the event or?
At the event.
Oh, at the event.
What do you do as a collaboration artist to bring people together? What techniques and styles do you use? As we get into conference design, I want to see sort of what you guys do, and then we'll get into the details of how to do it.
Right. So I would say with our conferences, in fact, I'm doing a little research now around certain technologies for conferences, and what I try to explain to people when I talk about our conferences, it is not all PowerPoint presentations.
Thank God. Can I pray to the God of not having PowerPoint presentations everywhere?
They're out there, but we try and minimize them. We also say, like, pedagogically, what are we trying to teach people about this content, and then what is the best way to deliver this content? So
answer those questions.
So sometimes the answer is, this is a session about the nonprofit. This is a session about private foundation laws, and therefore there will be a lawyer who is going to talk through points from PowerPoint.
Get ready.
Exactly. But I will say those are the best attended. But then there's sometimes it's a session. I sat in a session at our conference last year around what happens when the foundation makes a decision has been funding an organization for a long time and decides to change course and leave that funding. How do you maximize your exit when saying goodbye to that organization? That kind of session, there was a short presentation at the beginning, but it lent itself to a lot of conversation because there was a lot of wisdom at the room. So someone facilitating that conversation, we call it popcorn, where you reach out to the group and you ask different people to raise their hand and share. That session also had pair conversations. We asked people to turn to a neighbor and talk about that topic and what they've done or what their challenges are, and then we brought it back to the whole group. So I would say at our conferences, at any given session, there might be some reflection, self-reflection time. There might be a diagnostic that you take. There's going to be pair work or work in groups of 3 or 4. There's going to be different kinds of small group discussion, large group discussions, popcorning. We like to use an interview format where you bring in a member to share their story and you have someone interview them, much like
we're doing right now.
So we have a list, or another one. People like to talk about Ignite talks or lightning talks, and when we work with session designers, we share a list that I've pulled from various websites and given everybody credit, but pulled a comprehensive list of, I'd say, 60 different type session ways you can deliver content. And so we talk to people about what is their content, what are they trying to get across, and what's the best way to deliver the content.
What about the cross-generational issues are interesting, and how people are reacting to a way of doing a conference today versus 10 years ago or versus 10 years from now?
I have seen, I've been here for 12 years now, and I've seen a change in how many greatest generation baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials come to the conference. I think at our last conference, about 20% of the conference was millennials. Even 7 or 8 years ago, that number was more like 8 or 9%. I would say that the interesting piece of that is we now have 4 generations in conference sessions. So someone who is a millennial could be sitting at a table with a greatest generation person and sharing different ideas. You can read about what people say will happen to philanthropy because millennials are here. What we're seeing is it's that same energy. It's very inspirational to do philanthropy, and it's also can be crushingly hard because you're trying to solve something and you're trying to make a social change, and sometimes if you're not seeing what you want to see, and there's so much need, and I think a lot of our members see so much need that you're hopeful and you also know the difficulty of the work.
Do you see the millennial generation leaning into the greatest generation and the boomers, or do you see them trying to break out on their own? Are they respecting the past, or are they breaking the mold?
That's a great question. I think there's some ways they're breaking the mold. We hear a lot around impact investing. I'm sure you've heard about impact investing, and that millennials are much more interested in it. And a lot of firms that we work with are either have impact investing arms of the firm that are growing because of the interest they're seeing in boards with younger members on it.
So when they talk about impact investing, is there just a different R.O.I. measurement on an impact investment versus sort of like, I want to help the homeless, but I'm just thinking about this one program? Is it just more strategic, really?
Yeah, well, I think the thing with impact investing is you're looking at, quote, the other 95%. Foundations are only required to give away 5% of an average of their 12-month average of their assets. So the question that comes up a lot from younger generations as opposed to older generations is, what's happening to that other 95%? What is it doing, and how can we employ that towards our mission? So some people call it mission. I mean, there are different.
So we read an article on ASAE about your conference design process and things like that. Let's go through some of the details on what was in the article, and from your point of view, what the process was to get to a point of view where the conference really was impactful.
So what we do with our conference, so as I mentioned, we've spent 20 years doing conferences, and we've always curated all the content in-house. So you can imagine we were 7 or 8 staff. Each person would plan 7 or 8 sessions, finding speakers, crafting the content. We heard from members that they wanted to be more active in conference design. And so we thought, how do we get them more active in conference design, but maintain our quality? Because we've always scored pretty high with content quality. So when we did a call for sessions for the first time for the conference last year, we actually built in a process where those designers were coached by me and a colleague who combined have decades of experience working in nonprofits and then as well as here at Exponent and with funders. So the idea was to help them really hone in on what is their topic, what isn't their topic, and then what are they trying to get across, and then what's the best way to get that content across. So it isn't just 60 sessions with PowerPoint presentations.
Or I just interviewed yesterday Adrian Sager, who wrote the book on the Unconference.
Yes.
And so how far are you away from the Unconference? I guess you're feeling that you don't want it to be that spontaneous because you don't get the right content out of it. So there's somewhere in between an Unconference and a traditional control everything.
And I think you can think of our conference more about we're curating it, we're coaching the session designers, but also I think about a conference, someone has spent time and money to get to this location, and they want to get something out of it, but they also want to get what it says in the description. And I think the trickiest thing is always, what is your title and description, and does your content match that? And do you have a delivery method that is going to deliver what you're trying to communicate through your idea? And so what we did is we coached. We had at least, and this is very unusual I have found in the conference creation process, very unusual. We had 2 or 3 phone calls with our content session designers around their content. 2 that they had to participate in, and then optional ones after that, to really get at the crux of what are they trying to do in the session, and then eliminate what they're not trying to do and make sure that it's not too much for one time frame. I think some of the hardest things for people, we tell them you have 75 minutes and they send us a plan that's 2.5 hours worth of content. And I always feel like if you have 75 minutes, it's not that I didn't give you enough time, it's you didn't create the best program to get what you needed to get across.
And so when the person shows it to you initially, like what is usually the biggest problem, and what is your usual consulting recommendation?
The biggest problem is lack of focus.
Everywhere.
So someone thinks, I'm going to do this particular topic, and it's so broad, and there's so much content, and you only have 75 minutes. And when you think about a conference session, you want people to walk away with at least one thing, and you want to help them hone in on what's the one thing you want people to remember when they walk away. And that becomes the focus for how do we plan this session.
Okay, so let's get examples of somebody that's coming to you with this really broad and how you define it and make it clear.
Here's a really fun one. So we have someone who comes from the world of improv, and he says there are leadership lessons in improv that can be applied to philanthropy. So when we first started talking, he had this idea, we'll do a number of exercises, and then people will understand what we're doing. And then you think together about what is the most important thing for people to come away with. And we decided together it was to experience improv, but to also walk away with some lessons of how they can apply that to their day-to-day work. So we together tweaked his session plan. We only had 75 minutes. We cut out a couple of exercises. We added some time at the end for discussion so we can meet the objective interactive so they understand how these, like a release, but also engagement with their peers in a non-traditional way. And then also time with key questions at the end. How could they apply some of the lessons they learned? That's one example.
But let me push back a little bit on that. So you're at a conference for philanthropy, and you're hearing something on improv. How did you connect it to the topic at hand? What was the purpose of improv at your conference, of doing improv? Or could you get a lot of eye rollers?
We had a nice group to show up, and they loved it. It was really about lessons learned from improv. And I'll tell you, one of the games that they played, which maybe you know, it's a very common one that you hear about in comedy called Yes and. Mm-hmm. So Yes and, the premise is that when you're in a group of improv, that whatever someone says, as crazy as it sounds, you say yes and. So you can watch television now, sitcoms, and you'll watch the actors do this because the response that someone might say to a funny line is something that pushes that idea further. So the question was, they played that game, but then thought, how do you use this in philanthropy? Your board member comes to you with an idea. Instead of no, but, it's yes and. You go to meet a grantee. They suggest something. Instead of, well, no, but, it's how do I convert that to yes and how does that affect your leadership style? Maybe you are a small staff foundation, you have a couple of staff, you're 3 people that you're managing, and people have ideas. So how are you open as a leader to new ideas, and how does that directly apply?
So you're not learning improv, you're learning leadership skills.
Exactly.
So you have to put that in. And how do you put that in a description that's going to make somebody want to come when you see, you first know, so you got the session figured out.
Right.
How do you market it?
Interestingly, I'm reading the title aloud. This one says, Effective Leadership Lessons from the World of Improv. And I have to joke and say that before I moved to DC and started working in philanthropy, I was an education director at a children's museum. So I would say, all told, I have a lot of years writing session descriptions and titles. And I can tell when something is going to hit the mark, but also applies. I have a great admiration for newspaper headline writers, because the way that they summarize exactly what's in the article and the feeling of it, whether it's going to be, or movie reviews, whether it's going to be a positive review or negative review with a slight twist on the content, I admire that. We try to emulate it. I don't know if we always succeed, but we try to emulate that with our titles and our descriptions to get at the crux of the matter.
Do you think, though, is there a big difference between being a New York Post headline and a New York Times headline? How do you be sensational to get people to read it or come to the session, but it's not actually accurate?
That's a great question. I do remember was something that we talk about a lot in philanthropy is streamlining your giving. So if you're giving, or right-sizing your grants. So if you have, we call it streamlining. You have a $2,000 grant and you have a $1 million grant. You don't need the same amount of materials from the grant seeker in order to make that decision for something, a small grant like a $2,000 grant and a large grant like a $1 million grant. So one year we were doing a session, and I was trying to think of something a little more New York Post, like to appeal to people, because when we say streamline your giving, it just doesn't have that same cachet. And I think the movie Frozen had just come out. So we changed our title to Let It Go, What You Need to Know in Order to Give a Grant. And so it's playful, but I would say we don't go full New York Post.
So you got the session done, you're starting the marketing. How much time do you as the producer spend on the actual sessions and the subheads of the session? I mean, it seems like it's a really important part to, you said make it accurate, but also make it appetizing.
I'll tell you, with our coaching process, what we did was, because we were working with external designers, the very first step was they had to get on a call with us to talk about their content, as I mentioned. They draft something, they send it to us, and then we counter, and then they counter, and we did some back and forth, but ultimately, if we need to tweak something to make it read, well, I had 2 sessions last year that both started with when or something, and we had to tweak it.
Building a memorable experience for your guest means planning every detail right. Skipster is the guest management platform designed to help you create the perfect experience, from impressive online invitations to seamless check-in at the door. Get started at Skipster, spelled ZKIPSTER.com, for a free test event. So do you use the session titles as a part of the focus exercise too? Because if they're going to pitch it to you, they're going to write something, what's the name of your session? It's also going to be what will end up as the session title in many cases.
It's part of the discussion, and because of our marketing deadlines, I find also not all conferences do this. We like to open conference registration with sessions online. So you know what you're signing up for, and we do it a good 6 months before the conference. So in order to get to that deadline, by the time we accept all the designers, it's a pretty quick turnaround.
And you call them designers as opposed to speakers or something like that, right?
Because these are session designers. They are designing a 75-minute experience for their peers. So this could be a 75-minute experience where 2 people are talking and getting feedback from people in the audience. It could be where participants are engaging, but they are designing their content.
So that is a great nomenclature that other people should probably think about using. You agree with that? I
agree, and I think it also depends how you want your conference to play out. And for us, because our participants work pretty many of them work in isolation. So small staff foundation or no staff, you are working alone. And so you're coming to this conference to connect and to learn. And you want an educational experience. I've been to conferences where someone just yaks for an hour. They don't engage the audience at all. We are known for our educational content. And because of that, I have standards as someone with a background in education of what I think a session should be and how it should engage people. So it's interesting that you point out that we use the word designer. I use it very naturally, but I agree with you that I think more people, if they want an experience where it's not just where Q&A is not the only form of interaction, then you really need to design what that hour and 15 minutes is going to look like.
If a conference session is meant to have at least one takeaway, I think we just found the one takeaway that other people should emulate. And it's a nomenclature switch, and it's a little bit of a mind switch, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
What else? What other tricks do you have up your sleeve?
It's a great question. I had put together, and this is definitely took years in the forming, but it's finally at a state that I feel really proud of, which is a session design guide. And in fact, one of our session designers last year caught me at the evening reception and told me how appreciative she was of the support that we gave them during the conference process. She says she's never been so supported. They speak at a lot of conferences. And she also said something about this guide. And we handed to every session designer that we accepted when we accepted their session. It came with deadlines, and it came with obligations to talk to us and to work with us and to hone their session with us. But it also came with some quick tools, so you didn't have to search the internet for what is adult learning and you come up with millions of hits. We have a quick one-pager. We have a quick list of like 2 pages of ways you can do interaction in sessions. We have organized. We try and stay really organized and ahead of the game. We don't wait till the last minute. I've heard about sessions that really put all the content together in the last couple months, and there is
couple months. Talk about a couple hours.
Hours. Our process is much longer, and we acknowledge that it's much longer than others. But part of it is we get feedback from the participants that most of them choose to come to the conference because of the content. So if we don't have that content up for them to make a decision about whether to come, then that's harder for us.
So it's more like a syllabus of what you're going to learn.
In some ways.
So is the description, describe on your website, how long is the description? How detailed is it? What do you include to get people to understand what they're getting into?
Yeah. Its title, about a 50 to 60 word description, but 2 and 3 bullet points on learning objectives. And we also include session formats. So if someone is really not in the mood for small group discussions, you can pick a different session that may have a different format.
Authors? Speakers.
And then speakers. And we include where speakers are from, because we do like to highlight peer speakers in sessions. So sometimes the session designer is the speaker, and it might be a peer or a consultant in the field. And so we want to make sure people know that we are including their peers. Their peers are their teachers, and someone else is crafting the message to make sure that it is relevant to this audience. And that's, I guess, another trick up my sleeve is when we start with the session designers, we start with a required webinar to learn about the audience.
Go into that a little bit more?
So when we accept our session designers, we ask them to join us on an hour-long webinar to learn more about the conference, but also the audience. This audience is very particular, and it's, as every audience should be, about who they are. And we're very confident we understand our audience well. We're a 20-something-year-old organization, but not everyone coming as a speaker or someone who's invited, maybe someone who's not necessarily as familiar with the community, is invited as a speaker. This is an opportunity to explain who is in your audience so that we know the speaker is speaking to the audience. That's one part of the success of our conference sessions, is when the speaker really knows who is out there. And one example around our audience versus maybe another philanthropy conference audience is this lean funder. So you have to know that a third of the people in the room have no staff whatsoever. So if you're a speaker and you're saying, well, so here's my recommendation, just get one of your staff members to do blah, blah, blah.
Call IT.
You've now shut down a large percentage of the room who are either doing their own all the work themselves, or they don't have staff. So, and then also what we were talking about earlier in terms of what people fund. We know 70-something% fund in education, but there's so many different ways.
So it's intelligence, and you finding that people are appreciative, the speaker designers are appreciative of that, I assume, because they're usually working in a vacuum.
Very much. And also, I think there are a lot of misperceptions about our audience. For instance, we were talking earlier about...
Yeah, I thought they were all rich. And
but no, that's not the case. Yeah. Or that they're all family foundations. Right. That's another big misperception. This organization works only with family foundations. We're about 50% family foundations, but we also have independent foundations, corporate giving programs, community foundations, and individual donors, donor-advised fund holders. So that's something that we try and get across. And then also interesting, these nuances in the field. This is a small nuance, but it's very important to people in our audience, which is grant size. And I love this because someone actually once complained in an evaluation that the speaker said this, but a speaker might say, here's an example of a grant we gave. It was $2 million to the blah, blah, blah organization. Well, the average grant size among our members is closer to $30,000 or $40,000. So it's not very relatable when you think, well, we don't have $2 million. So it's these little nuances about our audience.
Just knowing who you're talking to.
Knowing who you're talking to.
Is a key lesson and a key takeaway. But it's so interesting that you say that, because a lot of times people just will book a speaker and they'll do their canned presentation and their eyes just glaze over because nobody really cares.
Exactly. And I think that's another reason why our content is usually rated so highly. It's because we've put all these measures in place. And especially last year, the first time we did a call for session, we were very concerned that if we weren't designing it ourselves, would people understand our audience and really speak to our audience? That was one of our key concerns.
So how do you do that? How did this innovation piece that you added, how is that going? And what is the reaction from doing it?
Yeah, people loved it. We got very positive feedback because we're talking now with being able to see a whole cycle. So we came up with this idea, we tested it, and then we didn't know. But we asked the session designers after the conference, how was this process for you? And the feedback that we got from them and also informally at the event was people felt supported. They felt like they appreciated our teaching the audience to them, so they made sure that they were successful. I mean, we want to set them up for success as much as they want to be successful in the room.
So conferences happen every 2 years in your case.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you don't repeat the same people, the session designers. What do you do? Do you repeat session designers? Do you repeat speakers? Do you just try to go for all new all the time?
I would say yes and yes. We try and bring in new voices through the call for sessions. We're hoping to bring in new voices. But then there are also certain stories in this community that are worth retelling over and over. We have some very inspiring members who we will bring back on multiple occasions because we want more people to hear that message. So I would say it's both. And when we do the call for sessions, one of the things we do is it is name blind. The reviewers do not see who they are. Once they have made their recommendations, we then take a look at the list and make sure how we're going to set up the conference and the sessions and various things like that. But there are always new names.
What about the whole Keynote thing? How do you deal with, big name to get people to come or substance? How do you deal with that whole issue?
Well, it's a great question. I find Keynote's one of the hardest things to do for any conference because, again, it goes back to audience. We want someone who's going to resonate with this audience. So when I read on the ASA listserv or the PCMA listserv about different speakers, and they all have great messages, I'm sure everyone who's listening gets unsolicited emails from someone who's written a book that wants to talk at your conference.
Right.
I usually come back with, it has to resonate for this audience.
But how do you make that decision to do that?
It's a collaborative process internally among staff. It's keeping our eyes and ears to the ground for people who have a message around philanthropy and giving.
And you're just consuming information all over the place, and then a small group of people are getting together to say, how about this? How about this?
We get recommendations from our host committee. We get recommendations from our members. We get recommendations from our board. And then we follow leads. At our conference last year, we had this very moving talk from a woman who her family was a victim of terrible crime, and she started a foundation in their memory. So she talked about this crime and this rise of hate and how to combat it, and then she also turned it to what her foundation is doing to be active. So I'm getting emotional just thinking about it. It was very emotional. It resonated with everyone.
But is it
that answers your question? It was not a well-known person.
But did someone see the person somewhere else, or do you sort of bring it from whole cloth out of your own?
One of our members works with her in that field. She is a colleague, and we asked a couple of members we asked members for recommendations, and he came back with her as a recommendation. She actually has a TED Talk. I'm not sure how widely it's been seen, but we watched the talk before we extended the invitation because we want someone who is a good speaker, not just if you do a TED Talk. And it was very powerful, very powerful.
But you won't go if you don't see them speak anywhere. If you haven't seen them speak anywhere, or you think this is a really interesting story, will you develop a keynote yourself, and listen to them and have them practice like sort of TED does? They discover people and then they work with them for months.
I wish,
but
we don't do that. I do remember many years ago taking a name on someone's recommendation. It was, I think, before TED. And to be honest, it was not a very dynamic talk. So we don't have the capacity to develop people like that, but we actually don't necessarily go for a big name. Our folks, when we do that survey, what brought you to the conference, keynote speaker is never at the top of the list. So we go for people that will have a message that resonates with the audience.
It depends on. But your marketing is a little different.
Yeah.
I mean, you're much more of a niche. So how do you know that these conferences work? That all the work that's been put in to the development, and like, how do you judge your ROI other than someone coming up to you and saying, "Oh my God, that was fabulous"?
Yeah, we have a number of different ways that we do it. So even just what I was saying before, we asked the session designers, we sent them an email afterwards, please evaluate. Obviously we send a note to all the participants, please evaluate. But we are a very high-touch organization, so something that we've always done, and we upped it this past year because we had all these new people designing sessions, is a staff person is in every room. So a staff person, we call them the point person. They greet the speaker, they help them with the technology, they hand out the handouts, they help people find seats. Then they settle in to listen. And one of the things that we instituted this year was a very quick evaluation sheet for the point person. So the point person sits there. How engaged was the audience? Who was in the audience? Did any particularly good quotes? Was this content that we could possibly repurpose in another way so that more people can learn from this particular session?
So it's qualitative observation.
Qualitative as well as quantitative from the surveys. Yeah.
So we're in the sessions. How do you deal with the social side of the conference? To make it impactful as well? Like, is there evening entertainment? What happens after the session ends, the sessions?
For every conference, we try and infuse the local philanthropic nonprofit sector, and that shows up in different ways. So it shows up in entertainment. So, for instance, one year we asked our host committee, and they recommended that we use a band from the School of the Arts. So these high school students came and performed at our evening event.
And the evening event is a dinner, is
yes,
a reception, is a cocktail party? What is it?
We have, at our conference is 2.5 days. Each day we have a reception. First one in the exhibit hall. Second one is always off-site at a local organization or venue that will hold our group. So different places we've had that event. The Chicago Cultural Center has that beautiful room with the Tiffany glass. We went to the Driscoll Hotel in Austin. So we moved from our hotel to that hotel, which has a neat space with lots of different rooms, and brought in some entertainment. We usually have I would say, a couple of different entertainment options at the conference, and they're always names or organizations that were recommended by the host committee that are local nonprofits.
What about dinner? Is it sit down? Is it
it's heavy hors d'oeuvres?
And that you found that works the best because people die if they have to sit for a long time.
Well, it's heavy hors d'oeuvres and beer and wine bar because people will go out afterwards. So we offer. It can be your evening activity if you want to make it your evening dinner. It can also be just your first stop for your evening.
Are you fostering those going out afterward things, or are they just happening organically?
We do. On the first night of the conference, we have our reception in our exhibit hall, and then that ends by 6:30, and then what we do are dine-arounds, which we actually orchestrate to some degree with volunteers. So say at a 900-person conference, 25 people will volunteer to host a dinner. They find the restaurant, they tell us their title and their description. We create a Google Doc so we both can keep track of the registrations before the conference, and then we bring all the papers to the conference and people sign up there, and we'll get about a few hundred people will go off-site in small groups on a variety of topics hosted by a member.
Based on a topic?
Yeah, they're usually topic-based. So they're like round tables, but with dinner offsite.
Right, and someone else, they're paying in their own way?
Sometimes they pay their own way. Sometimes it's hosted by, there might be a foundation that says, we want to gather people around environmental issues, and we're going to have it at this particular restaurant, which is one known in this city for sustainable food, and we can have 10 people and we'll pay. And then other times it's someone who says, let's talk about international giving, let's go to this cool Indian place, and I'm making a reservation for 8. Bring money.
Right. And what about the second night?
Second night is our host night event. So we don't schedule dinner because the host night event usually is, say, 6:30 to 8:30. So if you want it to be your dinner, it could be your dinner. If you want to go out later afterwards, it can. We do serve.
So a sponsor is going to.
No.
How does that work?
It's included in our budget.
Okay. And so what does it look like that night?
So it's a great question because I'm already looking ahead to our host night event for next year. So it's on the mind. It can be a variety. It's usually just a stand-up cocktail reception, but there's always some kind of entertainment depending on where we are. So, for instance, at our last conference, we were at the Philadelphia Fringe Arts has its own building right on the Delaware River by a revitalized pier under the Ben Franklin Bridge. It's really industrial.
So you try to make it sort of interesting for people, and it's a combined reception with it for everybody.
Yeah.
And then what about lunches?
We serve, so our conferences, breakfast, lunch, and the heavy hors d'oeuvres of the reception are included for all 3 days.
And is anything happen special for lunch, or is it
Lunch, it depends on the day. Sometimes lunch is a keynote speaker. Sometimes it's our member meeting. As a membership organization, we are required to have an annual member meeting. We do that at lunch. Sometimes it might be a panel. A couple times we've given out an award.
So it's active. It's active. It's not, but
sometimes it's small group discussions. We might say these tables are for education funders.
Right. So use that.
Yeah.
The exhibit hall. Who exhibits at your show?
Great question. We have different types of exhibitors who are interested in the philanthropy markets. So that would be investment managers, investment firms. Lately, we've had a lot of impact investing firms join us as well.
But it's not for the actual end recipient. Someone's going to say, I want to meet all the...
On a rare occasion, you might get nonprofit, some kind of nonprofit organization, but no, it's usually investment firms. It's grant management software. There are a lot of companies out there who have grants management software. We also have advisors, philanthropic services firms will come and exhibit at the conference. One year, we had a group of students from the business school who were doing some research around philanthropy, and they wound up we gave them a space at the booth to do research in the exhibit hall.
So what's the next one, and when is it coming up? And you're calm right now.
It is far enough away. The next one is in Anaheim. Early October 2020 in Anaheim, I was out at the hotel back in April to see the space, get a sense of the area. What are options for those dine arounds I was talking about? We're actually going to do this. Hotel has the Hilton has this amazing deck.
Let's end with how you see the future of this conference. Do you see sort of same state, or do you see any massive changes coming?
I think about iterative design. In fact, we're right now in conversation about what the conference is going to look like next year, and we're already tweaking. I think in some ways, certain things are the same. People like learning in workshops. They've told us that. They come for the content. They come for the educational sessions. There will be call for sessions. Call for sessions might change from year to year, but we will have that element. They also come to network. So we're talking a lot about how do we get more structured networking where people are meeting the people they want to meet.
Right. So actually, I lied. The last question is the political situation changing the content drastically? The world has changed a lot in the last few years. Are people asking for different types of content now, or no?
I don't think so. And I think it's because there are a lot of problems that people are trying to solve through their foundation work that are either the same or they ebb and flow. So if someone works with immigrant communities, they might have more urgency, but they need
it's a portfolio effect usually all the time, it sounds like.
Exactly.
In this business.
When you're working with social change, you're always working for social change.
Exactly. Great. Thank you so much. This has been so interesting. I'm totally geeked out on it. That's what we call the GatherGeeks, because it's all of us that are interested in this stuff want to pick up things. And I think there was a lot of takeaways today. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, we're back. As someone who recruits speakers and goes through submissions for sessions for BizBash Live, I really appreciate the peek into another organization's process. I can't say that we could pull off having a full lineup in place 6 months out before an event. or that we could dedicate that much time to coaching speakers. But I appreciate what they are doing here, and it's obviously working for them. I really like the idea of formalized staff evaluations of speakers in addition to attendee surveys. I guess the next step would be determining whether you share that with speakers. Yes, when it's flattering, or maybe it's just one tip that could help them get better as a speaker, but it would definitely be a difficult conversation to say, in essence, you bombed. I think there's more discussion there to happen on the topic of evaluations. Other tips like offering materials beforehand about your audience, about strategies for interaction, and other adult education tips really should be best practices for everyone. And if you can swing that webinar, go for it. So we just wrapped up our own conference, BizBash Live New York, and you can see what our speakers had to say and get a peek at our picks for the most engaging exhibitor booths in editorial coverage hitting bizbash.com this week. Before we end, I wanted to thank our producer, Dave Nelson, Claire Hoffman of our editorial staff, and Rebecca Pappas in audience development for their help with this and every GatherGeeks episode. And that takes us to the end for this week. So thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Gather on.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. We can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Player FM, Google Play, and Pocket Cast. Be sure to leave us a rating and review. It helps others discover the GatherGeeks podcast. We'd also love to hear from you. You can leave feedback on Twitter at GatherGeeks or leave us an email, GatherGeeks@bizbash.com. We hope you'll join us again for the next episode of GatherGeeks. Until then, gather on.